Hello, welcome to another episode of the Slice of Mentorship, the essential podcast for leaders who are committed to fostering entrepreneurship and mentorship at scale. I'm your host, Igor Gorlatov, and today we're fortunate to have Marianne Scully as our guest. Currently serving as the Dean of the Salinger School of Business and Management at Loyola University of Maryland, Marianne is also co-founder of Howard Bank. So let's gear up for a discussion filled with real-world expertise and actionable insights.
It certainly was the first enterprise that I founded. And I think in hindsight, probably the first thing that I would say is you have to be a little bit crazy to want to start anything, and especially to start what seems oxymoronic in some respects, a startup bank, because a bank is always going to be very regulated. And so is that contradictory to what a startup is all about? Obviously, I didn't think so, but it suggests that there has to be a little bit of a contradictory element, which means maybe a little bit of insanity. And the logical side of me would say you have to have a pretty significant appetite for risk to start a company like that. You know, that it's not for the faint of heart. It involves raising a fair amount of money. You can't start with $1 or $100,000. You have to start with millions of dollars. It does involve a very long, drawn-out application process. It involves looking for locations before you even have a charter. But one of the conditions of getting a charter is that you have to have a location, at least one location, to fulfill some of the regulatory requirements. So there's a lot of contradiction, but obviously a lot of reward. And I don't just mean financial reward, but psychic reward from starting to do something like that. But it was by far my first venture. And I remember going to informal advisors that I had, people who had sat on the boards of large banks that I had worked for, and having, in hindsight, the humility to say, do you think I can do this? Because I've always been a corporate person. And I remember one of the very experienced people that I talked to said to me, Marianne, you picked up the phone in the middle of the night and called people in Amsterdam to get appointments with them to try to talk to them about our banking services. If you could do that, trust me, you could start a bank. So it was helpful to have that kind of moral support and validation. But it was definitely a first for me. Although I will say that once I started down that path, I understood myself better because I realized that I was always what I term an intrapreneur. I was always the person inside a company trying to advocate for change. And I understood that was an inherent part of my personality, but I didn't understand it before I tried to start an external company, and then realized where the passion came from and the frustrations, quite frankly, came from. It's not easy to be an entrepreneur inside a big company, but some of it was forced upon me. I was assigned a job in an international banking group after running a large domestic group, and wasn't really told what I was supposed to do with this group, and asked myself, why am I here? I don't really speak other languages. I've only traveled overseas once in my life. And, it would say something probably in hindsight about the person that I worked for that I wasn't given that kind of guidance. But I, on my own, took a look at what was already happening and whether I thought those activities were sustainable, and then kind of asked myself what I could bring to the table. And it was a European division that at the time was mostly working with just bank to bank kinds of transactions, very boring, very low margin. But it was a time when a lot of European companies were buying American companies. And I thought, well, maybe that's why I'm here, because I can help these companies in Europe understand the American side of the equation. The banking system was very different at the time, much more antiquated in the US than the European system. I can explain that to them. But at the same time, once I'm more comfortable with the European side of things, I can help the American subsidiaries by saying, well, this is how they think in Holland, or this is why they do things this way in Germany. And that's exactly what I did. And the value proposition for both was we were a small bank, much smaller than most of the people operating in that space. And so I promised them that the same person who handled the European side of the equation would handle the American side. Same person, no need for communication between somebody at the London office talking to somebody in the New York office. And it worked. It worked really well. We were successful, but clearly that was just almost inventing it as you went along, which is part of what entrepreneurship is about. Much later in my career, I was offered an opportunity to take on a much bigger division and consolidate it into other operations that I had. And I knew that it wasn't working at the time. And so I conditioned this promotion, pretty brave thing to do, conditioned my acceptance of this promotion on being able to reorganize the whole thing and to make it look more like community banks, where instead of having these divisional silos, we'd have a person in each geography that was responsible for everything that our bank did in that geography, so that it would look like a community bank. And they accepted it and bought into it. And then interestingly, that obviously gave me the appetite to do more in the community banking space, which I then translated directly, not even indirectly, into starting a bank in the early 2000s. Well, I came from a different generation of bankers where mentorship was not necessarily as embraced as it is today. And so there weren't formal mentorship programs. You basically had to look for mentors and you had to ask people to help you. That was good in hindsight. Clearly, you have to have more initiative to do that than to become part of a regular mentorship program. But along the way, I found that mentorship could be very transactional. Let's set up a meeting, let's talk on a regular basis, and not necessarily transformative unless it became something more than mentorship. And at some point, I was introduced to the concept of sponsorship. And I think that's a much more transformational relationship than mentorship, because it means that the experienced person is doing more than just giving you advice on a regular basis. They're becoming your advocate and they're becoming your internal sponsor to suggest that you should look at certain opportunities and to be an internal reference if you agreed to search out those internal opportunities or experiences. So part of it is generational and who embraced mentorship 35 or 40 years ago. But part of it is also looking at different mentorship models. And I really do think a mentor needs to be more than just a passive advisor. They need to be an active advocate. And that's what sponsorship is. And that really can make a difference in somebody's life.
I like the point you made in one of our previous conversations about mentorship and sponsorship being on the same spectrum.
They are. They're a continuum. They're part of a continuum. They're technically the same sorts of activities, but one is much more transactional and one is much more transformational. And I think it's because as you move along that continuum, the sponsorship requires much more emotional investment. Doesn't necessarily need to be a lot of time, but much more of an emotional investment and an emotional commitment on the part of the sponsor. So, I took this position in part because of the same reason that I take those board positions, although this is obviously full time, very, very involved, very big commitment, but it was about impact again. And it was about leveraging experiences that I had and expertise that I had. And in a way, as I reflected on it since our last conversation, it's got that entrepreneurial element as well, because it's taking experiences and expertise, but twisting them in a very different direction. But it started with the impact, and the impact in turn influences the goals. So I believe that higher education, any education, is something that can play a transformative role in a young person's life. I felt that in my own life. I absolutely don't believe I'd be where I am today if it weren't for educational experiences that I had along the way and experiences with educators. So what an amazing opportunity in a different chapter of my life to have an impact on young people. But it's a very tough time in higher education. There are tons of existential questions that are being asked about the value of education and the value of degrees. And does any of it really matter? It's a very important time and a huge opportunity, I think, for higher education institutions to provide more access to those opportunities. So my vision and my goals are to scale those opportunities for impact and to scale those opportunities for access and to affect as many young people's lives as possible and to use my own experiences so that they can become transformative career opportunities, that it's not just a piece of paper or a degree, but it's a launching into their own careers so that they can then create their own impact and they can create their own legacies. But to make that happen, it's not something that I'm going to do by myself. And it's not normally something that I'm going to do directly because it's really faculty that make the difference in a student's life. So how do I use my leadership skills, if you will, to motivate our faculty and to open the minds of our faculty to occasionally doing things in a different way, whether that's a different curriculum or a different program or a different way of measuring their own success as teachers and their own success as researchers who aren't necessarily just researching alone, but are involving students in research. So it's part of that same continuum of leveraging experiences, leveraging expertise, but doing it in a different way, which does involve probably more of an entrepreneurial mindset. So that at the end of the day, we're changing the trajectory of as many students' lives as possible. Yeah, I mean, it does start with a vision, and a shared vision. And I think fortunately that's not something that I had to build. It's just something I had to flesh out. You know, we're blessed in that we do have faculty that are very committed to student success. And even our tenure track PhD faculty, while they're motivated by their own research, are also motivated by student success. So the shared vision always is the place to start. The next step is the boring strategic planning part of the exercise. And that was one of the first things that I did when I came on board. And my only differentiation point was to try to make sure that people all understood the plan and embraced the plan, that this wasn't just something that was being done in the dean's office, so to speak. And that took a good year, and it took a lot of challenging conversations and a lot of 2 steps forward and 3 steps backward occasionally. But at the end of that year, people did engage with the plan and buy into it. And then probably the other thing that I've always tried to do with strategic plans, and I've done it here as well, is make people understand that that is just a starting point. It's not the end of the game when you have a plan. It's the beginning. And that people need to assume ownership. So we have people that have said, yes, I know that I'm responsible for that part of the strategic plan, and putting numbers behind it. Well, if we believe in experiential learning, how much more experiential learning do we want to do? If we believe that faculty can engage students in their research, how often do we want that to happen? And then incorporating that into faculty evaluations. So it really is converting a strategic plan into an operational plan, into a set of tactics, keeping it front and center all the time. We talk about our strategic plan at least once every other meeting. And we talk about where we are on the goals and where we are on the objectives. And we have started incorporating it into individual faculty members' evaluations. And I think that's what makes it real. But it also gives you the outline, it gives you something to look back on and to say, all right, here's what's going to make it real, and here's how we measure our success. And it involves a lot of communication. And it involves, on my part, a lot of acceptance of the fact that if the other parties aren't buying into this, it's never going to happen. So I think if I had been in the corporate world, the kind of manager that just said every day, all right, here it is, now you go out and execute, as opposed to, let's talk about this. Do we agree? How are we as a team going to do this? It would never, ever work in a shared governance environment like a university. But if you've always been a persuader and an influencer and not a dictator, you have a better chance of success. Way too early to say whether we've got success or not. But I know we have a better chance of success because I always have tried to be at least a persuader and an influencer rather than a dictator. I agree that things are the way they are for a reason. But is that all that we want? That acceptance of this is why things are the way they are. Is that all that we want? Don't we want more for ourselves? So you're appealing to people on a very human level. Don't you want to be the best that you can be? And that human beings are human beings, whether they're on a college campus or, in a boardroom. And if you appeal to that human desire to be better, I think it pays off more than people think it will. I'm obviously not a cynic, but I think it pays off more than people think that it will. I think that there's a certain resistance to how much an individual faculty member or individual administrator can really do. It's the, lead a horse to water, but can't make him or her drink syndrome. So, you can create a good environment in the classroom. You can create these outside of the classroom experiences. You can't force a student to absorb that. And that's true. But if you create the right environment, and again, if you try as much as possible to reject the cynicism that often comes with experience, you have a better than even chance of getting the absorption and getting the student buy-in. And once you do that, then you're more than half of the way home. If you're saying to a professor, we are going to hold you responsible for students learning certain things. And we understand that occasionally it'll be 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, and we're not going to punish you for the 3 steps back, but we are going to hold you accountable for saying, why did I take 3 steps back? And what do I need to do differently the next time? That's the buy-in to the journey. And weirdly, not that you want to get into the regulatory aspect of higher ed, because it is a highly regulated industry, just like banking was. We just call it accreditation in higher ed. That's really what the accreditors want to see. They want to see you embracing the journey of saying, yes, this didn't work, but here's what I'm going to try the next time. Yeah, there's a debate, as you know, there is a debate as to whether or not scaling is important. So I'll preface all this by saying, this is my personal opinion. In the persuading and influencing theme, it's certainly an area where I'm seeking some influence, but there's not a universal acceptance of the fact that scaling is important. But at the end of the day, I think that small business creation is all about employment creation. It's the business side of what my vision is for the academic side of the university. It's changing the trajectory of people's lives. It's changing the trajectory of a community's life. And that means more employment. So I think scaling is hugely important. And it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with people that want standalone, sole proprietorship kinds of businesses. But I think when it comes to resource allocation. And I'm also a huge believer in allocating resources to the things that we think will have the highest long-term value, that capital resources, financial capital, human capital resources should be devoted to the businesses that have a chance of scaling. And that doesn't mean 1 million employees or 100,000 employees or even 1,000 employees. But I recently saw an initiative in Seattle where the city of Seattle is working with 2 institutions of higher education. One that I know well because they're also a Jesuit institution, Seattle University. And they're starting a program to try to nurture entrepreneurs. But their first criteria is that the companies that they are supporting have to have at least 3 employees. So it's not saying 1,000 employees, but it's acknowledging that a company with 3 employees will be 10 times as impactful as a company that only has 1 employee. I think it's still in debate, but I think as we look back, and have gathered data on the entrepreneurs that we've supported. So we're in our 5th year of a cohort of 8 to 12 startups, definitely startups. No requirements that they have to be at the revenue generating stage already. But as we look back on those companies, the fact that they've gone through an accelerator does suggest, and 4 years it's a small time frame. It's hard sometimes for some of my colleagues to understand 4 years is really a nanosecond in the life of a company. But if you look at the last 4 years, just the experience alone means there's a higher success rate in terms of the company still being around. But when you think about other measures of success, have they grown their revenue? Have they been able to access more capital? The ties to having more than 1 employee are clearly very strong. And so this year, as we had people apply for the program, we at least asked more questions around, do you have any other employees? Is this basically your full-time job now? Are you spending more than 20 hours a week? Do you have any revenue? Do you have any product validation? And so we're asking the questions that will allow us to better estimate who's likely to be more successful going forward. So I think it's already, changed at least the lens through which we look at this. I think yes. And, you've inspired a lot of thought in me on this, but, first of all, technology can enhance anything. It doesn't mean that technology is replacing the human side of things, but, there's certain pieces of information and advice that can be transmitted in a downloadable format that doesn't necessarily involve 2 people sitting across a lunch table from one another. That's scaling. It's scaling from a how many people are you reaching perspective, but it's also scaling from a how many times are you reaching that person. That's the great thing about technology, whether it be a podcast or a webinar, is that somebody can access the information over and over and over again. One of the things that I think universities learned during the pandemic was that if you are going to transmit your classroom expertise online, especially if you're going to do it asynchronously, you need to record that classroom experience so that somebody who learns differently can go back and access it on multiple occasions. So mentorship is no different. And we talked about the emotional side or the organic side of sponsorship. So there's absolutely no reason why Mentors for Entrepreneurs and all of our accelerator enrollees, all of our accelerator graduates have been assigned a mentor, somebody that's in their industry that in addition to the classroom and the teamwork that we're having them do can work one-on-one with them in a very customized fashion because it's somebody that knows their industry. Many of those people who were assigned as mentors have stayed involved and have become sponsors. Whether it's helping them get clients, whether it's helping them get employees, whether it's helping them access capital. So it's much more tangible than just an advisory conversation. Absolutely. That's the goal, right? I think the advice to myself, and it's advice that I still give, especially to young women, is don't be afraid of failure. You don't have to be so perfect and so unwilling as a result to take a chance or to take a risk because you don't want to fail. And, failures are always painful, but most people who are successful will tell you they learned more from their failures than they did from their successes. But a book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Stephen Covey.
That concludes today's episode of the Slice of Mentorship podcast.